Welcome to our December Ethics Roundtable. We're dressed for the holiday and hope that everybody is ready for the end of the semester. I'm very pleased to introduce Michael Corl from the College of Engineering and Applied Science. As an ethics fellow this year, he is going to present a very important topic, protecting your profession. So let's be interested in listening to Michael about protecting your profession and how the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles can apply to this important topic. Michael?
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Thanks everyone for joining this morning. I certainly appreciate the interest in this. I'll give you a little, little background on myself here. I've been at UCCS for since August of 2020, so about a year and a half, maybe call it that. I came here from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, where I was a permanent military faculty member. I was a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, which is in New London, Connecticut. The Coast Guard Academy is probably something that most of you haven't heard about, but it's about a quarter of the size of like Air Force, West Point, Navy. And I figured it was important to give some background on my personal ethics and how they were developed. And I would say, I was a good kid in high school and stuff, but really didn't think much about this stuff till I got to the Coast Guard Academy. And they have honor concept there, which is neither lie, cheat, steal, nor attempt to deceive. It's a little different from the honor codes that the other academies have, because they would add nor tolerate those who do at the end. So it's a little more gray area based, as opposed to black and white like the other academies. The academy, another motto they have there is, "Who lives here reveres honor, honors duty." While I was a cadet, I participated in the annual ethics forum, which has been going on for over 30 years now. So certainly a big part where they stop classes for a couple of days and you have speakers come in and do a lot with that. I was also the battalion honor officer when I was a junior, in charge of training the 4th class about the honor concept. Following my time at the academy, I was an officer in the Coast Guard for 25 plus years, and the core values of the Coast Guard are honor, respect, devotion to duty. So again, this has been pretty much my life. Probably, since 1991, when I started the academy, all that time. So it's certainly been quite a while working with this and working with cadets and really pushing this through. So I was happy to be a part of this because it's sort of close to home for me and something I'm definitely interested in. All right, moving on. So, I figure we'd start and I'll probably not put anybody on the thing, but everyone knows of some professions that have some bad reputations. And again, if anybody wants to offer one up, that's fine, but we're not saying that these professions are unethical, but rather calling attention to the reputation that might be out there. And certainly in any profession, you can't, say everybody has bad reputation. There's good and bad in everything. So if anybody wants to offer one up, I'll give you that. But otherwise, I'll go ahead and point out some that when I gave a presentation to some students a couple weeks ago, some of the ones they came up with, which was rather entertaining. I suspect they're a little less filtered than we will be in our thing. So if anybody has one to offer up, I see something in the chat. Used car dealer. That's funny because that's the first one that they came up with as well. So, and that, again, are all used car salesmen bad people? No, certainly not. But there's, that's the reputation out there. You never can trust that you're getting the best deal and so on and so forth. Along with used car dealer came the car mechanic, right? Are you always getting the straight scoop from them? And are they just trying to make a few extra bucks and guessing that you don't know as much as they know and so on and so forth. Some other ones that came up, and I'll let you off the hook with this is, somebody mentioned lawyers. Okay. And again, it's not all lawyers, certainly, but there's certain, fields of law that might have the bad reputation. Ambulance chasers was one that kind of came up, but another one that comes up, and this is in TV and books and all that, are the defense attorneys. And theirs isn't necessarily because of bad reputation. Theirs is more about the morals of defending a guilty person and so on and so forth. And I think if you watch the news lately, you can see that there's been some some criticism of some folks lately. Other ones that came up, and again, I'm trying not to make this political or anything, but politicians, and I don't think it was necessary. Thanks, Colin, right on cue. But and I don't think it's a Democrat or Republic issue. I think it's across the board generally. And then a new one that I would say has come up probably in the last few years is the media, right? And again, it's not a left-right conversation, but I think a lot of people are having trouble trusting any media at this point. So it's interesting what came up, and certainly you picked a couple that the students picked up. So talking about things that are maybe a little more positive here, what are some of the professions that have good reputations? Okay, I'll give you a second if anybody wants to chime in to the chat. All right, nurses. Tracy, you must have been at that lecture I gave, because that was the first one. Healthcare was the one. Teachers, very good. They kind of did healthcare. I thank them because my wife's a nurse, so it worked out pretty well that they were complimenting her. But yeah, you don't hear a whole lot with nurses and doctors. Obviously, there are some that cross those lines. You could look at Dr. Kevorkian from back in the 90s. That was one that had a lot of ethics and morals attached to it. But for the most part, you don't hear bad things about doctors and nurses and certainly teachers. And again, there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, those are professions with good reputations. Yeah. So yeah. So someone put in the chat, we're starting to see some reputation issues with people who are spreading disinformation about COVID. Yeah, and I think we're probably best to leave leave that alone for now. But yeah, like I said, there's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, I think you speak very highly of these folks. Other things that came up were the military. I think that was said in part because of my background as a Coast Guard officer, and then because I was talking to a room full of engineering students. Obviously, we heard about engineers. So couldn't be more accurate to give that engineering one because I'm an engineer and that's who I was talking to at the time. And that's sort of the focus of my ethics project here. So I kind of put together a list of kind of what I call a recipe for ethical profession. And if you look at the first few bullets, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these, look at the first few bullets, those are things that are pretty much done at the academic level, right? We have program accreditation. I'll show where that fits in. We sprinkle ethics throughout our curriculum, and certainly that's Tracy's goal, right? To make sure that as many students as possible are talking about ethics. Professional societies help this, and if I know the involvement in professional societies really starts as students, right? And then hopefully they'll see the benefits of it and continue on as they move forward. But pretty much every professional society I've looked at has their own code of ethics, and they're all very similar. There's not a whole lot of variation between them, but they're certainly there. And then when you get kind of post-graduation, you look at licensing standards and keeping your law license or your medical license and even engineering license and others. And that licensing comes with responsibilities, and there's a risk of losing it if you get yourself in trouble. And the way that would happen through ethics committees or review boards. Obviously there's like state medical boards, things like that. There's the bar for lawyers. All that comes into play as you go through. And most of all, I think what you start seeing is people holding themselves accountable, right? Or holding their profession accountable. A lot of these ethics reviews that happen for lawyers and medical and engineers and other professions tend to be reported by their peers, right? Or the customer, I guess, in some cases. But that holding selves accountable is a big piece of this, because if you're not going to hold your own profession responsible, then you risk getting that bad reputation, and that bad reputation impacts the whole profession. As we talked about a few that still that probably have been bad reputations for hundreds of years. So, I'm going to shift a little and talk a little bit about engineering, because again, that's my profession. And just real quick, why are ethics so important for engineers? Okay, and this is a pretty important question. I certainly posed it to the senior design students that I talked about ethics with. And the things that came up or continue to come up here are, first of all, engineers have a great responsibility with regards to safety of people, property, and the environment. There's a public trust that has to be maintained. And lastly, they have technical skills that everyday people don't have. And those technical skills need to be used and again, towards that goal of safety of people, property, and the environment. Okay, and those are pretty important. And I'm going to go through and talk a little bit more about these and how they tie in with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And I think you'll see some pretty interesting things and how aligned everything is here. So as far as accreditation goes, and again, ABET is the engineering accreditation body. It used to stand for Board of Engineering, or Accreditation Board of Engineering Technology, but then they got rid of all that and just call themselves ABET from now. But again, there's two different types. One has to do with, for our purposes, the mechanical aerospace engineering and the electrical computer engineering, and they have this criterion 3 of student outcomes, and the 4th student outcome that they list is an ability to recognize ethical and professional responsibilities in engineering situations and make informed judgments, which must consider the impact of engineering solutions in global economic, environmental, societal context. It's really a mouthful, but at the end of the day, this ability to recognize ethical and professional responsibilities. A lot of students have a hard time, and again, it has to, they get their ethics from growing up from parents and school and church and a host of, friends and so on and so forth. But a lot of times they have a hard time seeing where ethics is going to come into play as they get older. So presenting them with case studies and making sure they can see how this came about and what impacts there were and why people made the decisions they made is important, so that as they get into these real life scenarios, they can take a second, think about it, and make the right choice as they move forward. Again, that ability to recognize those situations is pretty important. And with, and a lot of them just, it's funny when you talk to them, they have a hard time, they've heard about a few things here and there, but they didn't really think about the ethics that were involved in what they were hearing. Our computer science program, they get accredited by ABET as well, but theirs is the accreditation of computer programs. So it's a slightly different thing. And you can see that they have recognized professional responsibilities, make informed judgments and computing practice based on legal and ethical principles. Okay, so a little different wording, but again, getting towards the same end goal as far as the students go. So, we as a university are responsible to show how we're meeting these student outcomes. And so we have incorporated in our curriculum various ways for students to demonstrate that they're achieving these outcomes, and we have to report that assessment onto ABET every 6 years when they come to accredit our program. And so this is something that happens every year. To give you an idea, just this fall alone, we have all these courses. There's 7 different courses that were offered that have ethics. In some cases, for example, this CS 3050, I'm trying to point at it, CS 3050 with 60 students, that's a real ethics course. The whole course, it's a writing intensive course. They talk about ethics principles and then, tie them into case studies. The students write about these things and how they might come up in their profession. So that course is entirely ethics related. Engineering 3040 is an engineering ethics course. Okay, so the other ones are like senior design and some intro type courses, but you can see here at 3 different levels of students, freshman, sophomore, and senior level students, they're getting some ethics in these courses. Okay, and in all of this fall, 371 students have done ethics exercises in class as part of satisfying those ABET requirements, and of course educating the students on ethics so they're more prepared for challenges that come in the future. As I mentioned, thanks, Trish. I mentioned the professional society. So here's a couple of the ones, and it's not an all-inclusive list of the different ones here in engineering, but again, and I'll show you examples of the Society of Mechanical Engineers, what their code of ethics says. But again, each of these societies have them. The students get involved in these. I used to use the code of ethics as part of the teaching of ethics to the students, so they could see it's not just me standing up there telling them they need to be ethical, but the whole society of their profession is saying this and making sure that people are acting in the best interests and ethically. So as we look at these to get a little more close, first they typically have their fundamental principles or canons, and you start looking, and I try to highlight words because there's going to be a lot of words on the screen here, but you have integrity, honor, dignity, being honest and impartial, serving with fidelity. You start seeing these words, and again, I'm gonna tie this all back to Daniel's Fund Ethics Initiative here shortly. But as you go through this, and here's their fundamental canons here. Okay, and again, if you look at just the highlighted pieces, which will be easier, and every bullet has something. So they hold paramount safety, health, and welfare of public. Engineers shall perform services only in their areas of competence. Okay, and that's a pretty important one. Shall not compete unfairly with others. They shall continue their professional development and provide opportunities of professional ethical development of those engineers that work for them. Okay, so there's that whole continuing the cycle, right? The people that follow them are important as well. Shall avoid conflicts of interest. Shall respect the proprietary information and intellectual property of others. They should only work with other reputable persons or organizations. In other words, if they find that people aren't really on the up and up, then maybe don't work with them. And part of that is you don't want to be put in the same bucket as them, right? If you're continuing to associate yourself with bad people, then eventually you're going to look like a bad person as well. Avoid any conduct which brings discredit upon the profession. Consider environmental impact and sustainable development. I mostly mention that to students because that environmental impact hasn't always been a part of what we do, right? You think back 20, 30 years, the environment wasn't nearly as held nearly as important as it is now. So that's certainly a new part of this, or I guess a newer part, I should say. Basically shall not seek ethical sanction against others unless they have good reason to do so. So there's that kind of holding each other accountable and holding themselves accountable, and then abide by Constitution, bylaws, and policies. Okay, so you see all these things, and again, think about these parts that I've highlighted, and we look at the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, and we see things we saw about acting with integrity, maintaining the public trust, holding each other accountable, working in a fair way, or competing with fairly with others. Respect the rule of law we saw in the last one, and then the viability to create long-term value for all relevant stakeholders. You could see the parallel of all these things to the stuff I just mentioned. I'm assuming that's no accident at all. And the Daniels Fund is clearly very, very wise in how they put this up, as so are the societies, quite frankly. So that's pretty good. So what I'll do now, and the students really enjoyed these, I'll talk a little bit about some of the case studies that we talked about. First, we talked about what drives people to do unethical things, right? And it was interesting to hear the students' response to this, and they did a pretty good job of figuring it out. And I'm sure most people on the line here can certainly put together their own list. But the list that sort of came up was, greed, certainly money or success was a big part of it. Sometimes people do unethical things because somebody putting pressure on them to get results or do stuff. Some things are acceptable by the peers, right? That rule doesn't really matter. No one really checks on that type thing, justifying their actions. Perhaps they can't see far enough ahead, and you're going to see one that this becomes obvious in the case studies. They can't see far enough to see where it would cause a problem. Okay, maybe they just don't have the ethical awareness they need. Sometimes they kind of they make a mistake and then they do something unethical to avoid getting in trouble, right? As opposed to owning up to the mistake. And then laziness becomes a factor here, and laziness may not be them intentionally acting unethically, but at the end of the day, you'll see with the case study what happens on one of them. So I have a couple of case studies we'll talk about a little bit in detail, and then we'll talk about a few rather quickly. The first case study here, this is fairly recent, 2015. Volkswagen had an emissions violation. So basically, they purposely altered lab results to meet the emission standards with the use of what they called a defeat device. Okay. Basically, it was some software that detected they were in the lab and adjusted the power and performance so that it basically met the requirements. Okay, so basically through some computer, so somebody purposely wrote the software, purposely incorporated it in the lab results so that they could meet the standards. When the cars were on the road, their emissions were actually 40 times above the permissible levels. So they weren't even really close to what was the expectation. Now, with these cars, the interesting thing was a lot of time and effort and resources went into developing new technology, and they were actually advertising these as low emission type vehicles as like a sales point. They used these devices for quite some time. When they, from 2008, when they discovered they couldn't meet the pollution standards. So one of the things I talk to the students about is, okay, what, all this comes out, the investigation's done, so on and so forth. What are the results? What ultimately came down? Now, we also talked about what caused them to make these decisions, right? Somebody made a decision and said, hey, let's figure out a way around these results. And that was kind of that pressure from above. The need to get a return on the investments they made and basically sell cars. So it was a business decision in some aspect, and it was pressure put on them. And then the engineers, rather than say, no, we can't do that, the engineers went along with it. So, again, certainly as culpable as others. So the result here turned out to be the CEO resigned, okay, because this pretty much went all the way to the top, and it went on so long that they decided that was pretty important. Volkswagen pled guilty to criminal charges of defrauding the U.S. government and obstructing the investigation. So that, again, they piled on their problem, right? Instead of just coming clean, they continued to try to hide things. They wound up paying close to 19 million dollars, or billion, I should say, with the B settlement. That's a huge settlement. Largest in the history of consumer class action cases for the automobile industry. Okay, so they crossed line after line after line and then tried to cover it up, which all added to their criminal charges. Interestingly, a note of back in the 70s, Volkswagen had a similar issue where they did this too, and that time they were only fined like $140,000 or something, if memory serves me. So that had been down this road before. Clearly, a big problem in the grand scheme of things with what they did here. The second case study, this is really recent news, quite frankly. This was in the news like 2 or 3 weeks ago. There's a metallurgist whose job was to analyze steel test results the steel was going to be used to build U.S. Navy subs. Okay, they provided false positive readings for strength and toughness tests over 240 cases between 85 and 2017. Now, if you can imagine the number of submarines that were built during that time, and again, here's a case where this person didn't have anything to gain from this. All right, and this is sort of that laziness came in, the person not being able to see far enough ahead to see what their actions could, the consequences of their actions. Basically, the company, no one was telling this person to do it as far as they found. This person was acting mostly on their own. So again, it's hard to see like the what the incentive was in this particular case. So the company found out in 2017. They suggested to the Navy it wasn't fraud, which really which caused the Navy investigation to go a different direction. And finally, they figured out that the company again tried to cover it. So there's the company covering up a little bit there. When I don't think they necessarily had to. They could have just come out and said, here's everything we know. This was a person that was acting poorly, but for whatever reason, the company made a bad decision there. So the good news is there haven't been any reports of submarine hulls failing, which would be a significant news, and certainly with where they operate and where they do their work, that could have potentially been disastrous for sure. But they did say that the Navy incurred increased costs of maintenance to ensure the submarines were seaworthy. So in other words, the steel didn't hold up as well as it should and probably had to be replaced, and the subs had to get more maintenance than expected. The company paid almost $11 million settlement, and now the metallurgist is facing 10 years in prison and a $1 million fine for their actions. So this was pretty interesting. Again, I was talking to engineers, and they could see that, it's hard to tell in this case what the reasons for faking the things, whether it was just laziness, incompetence, or whatever, or the person felt that they were being pressured to have positive results for the company. So it was pretty interesting in that regard. All right, so some other ones, and these are ones that are probably more familiar to a lot of people. Certainly those of us who are a little older. The Ford Pinto sold 2.2 million of these cars. They had a problem with the fuel tank and the lines, in that if they got rear-ended, the line would sever, and the likelihood of the car catching fire was pretty significant. It turned out that Ford knew about the issue, and the engineers found a fix that would have cost only $11 per car. And ultimately, it was decided that would, it would delay production. It would, cause other costs and so on and so forth. And in the end, I think they attribute at least 180 deaths to this design thing. So again, you start seeing the difference, or the interaction between engineers and management, or the business side of these companies in the decisions that are being made. Space Shuttle Challenger, they had the O-ring failure on takeoff, and the shuttle exploded, and all 7 astronauts died in the explosion. This was the Space Shuttle Challenger mission was pretty big, because this was the one that they opened up to a teacher. So I believe the teacher was a woman from New Hampshire that went through whatever competition or whatever and won the ability to go to space. So it was a lot of news, a lot of focus on this. Ultimately, they said there was a lot of pressure to launch. A lot of these space shuttle launches were delayed over and over again. And in this particular case, because of how much marketing they had done, and how much media attention there was because of the teacher going to space, there was a lot of pressure to launch, even though they suspected they had some issues. Deepwater Horizon, again, this is relatively new. It's probably not quite as new as I'm thinking. That probably 7-8 years ago. It was an offshore oil structure down in the Gulf of Mexico. No one had ever heard of a blowout preventer before, but the blowout preventer is this pretty significant size contraption that goes in the ocean floor, and it has all these backup plans and safety devices that is supposed to shut off the flow of oil if they start having problems. Ultimately, you could see the stats there: 87 days it lasted, or the oil was spilling out of this well. 134 million gallons of oil was the estimate, and there was an oil slick over 43,000 square miles. Then the oil eventually got to the shore. There were some people on the oil rig that died in the explosions. And ultimately, what was this? BP paid $4 billion in fines and penalties. And to BP's credit, they took responsibility. They said that they were going to make things right. They were going to, and they paid businesses that couldn't work. They did oil cleanup and all that. So they actually responded pretty well. The issue that happened was, and this goes back to the work only in your area of knowledge. Basically, the engineers had modified the blowout preventer a couple times in ways that basically prevented it from working. And the blowout preventer is one of those things that, they kind of assume works, and maybe they tested it in certain conditions, but when they tried to push the buttons to make it work, ultimately it didn't work because of the modifications that the engineers made on it that weren't tested and properly vetted. So that was definitely a engineering ethics issue, and working outside their area and not reporting it and not doing stuff. The oil industry, here's Coast Guard me talking quickly. The oil industry was largely, they were regulated, but for the most part, because they hadn't had any real disasters on these oil rigs. For the most part, they were doing a great job of kind of regulating themselves and weren't really high on the list of priorities for the Coast Guard in a lot of ways, mostly because they had a pretty spotless record. This really opened people's eyes and put more focus on them, and probably focus that they'll have a hard time getting off them moving forward. The next one is the New Orleans levee system, and this is after Hurricane Katrina, where 80% of New Orleans and surrounding area was flooded because the levees gave way. 18,000 deaths were attributed to the levees breaking, and $100 billion worth of damage. In this case, the engineers involved, it was basically poor design, and then they didn't even follow their own design standards when they built the levee system. So it was definitely an engineering issue, and cutting corners and not doing due diligence in the construction. The last one, because everyone's heard of it and most everyone's seen the movie, the Titanic. And this one's pretty interesting because there are a couple of things that happened. So basically, if you know about the Titanic, there's what they call watertight bulkheads. And the idea of the bulkheads is they separate the ship into multiple sections. So the ship was able to flood several sections without sinking. Okay, and the idea is the bulkheads control where the water is to a certain point. The problem is the bulkheads didn't go all the way up to the top. So as water flooded in, eventually it started spilling over the bulkhead into the next section, which the bulkhead's supposed to prevent that from happening. So there were some design issues there. The other thing is when the ship was built and they saw the lifeboats that were on the side of it, and they were claiming that this was this unsinkable ship because of the bulkhead design. The owners said, it really looks bad that we're saying this is unsinkable and we have all these lifeboats. It kind of contradicted what they were saying. So they limited the number of lifeboats to 20. Okay. And they said that the deck looked too crowded and looked unsafe because of all the lifeboats that they had. So they limited to 20. And in the end, they had the 1,500 deaths as a result of the ship sinking because of the bulkhead design. And then the decision, to limit the number of lifeboats that was made for 100% the wrong reasons. The interesting thing is, again, going back to the Coast Guard is what happened after this, right? That Titanic is gone, all these deaths, and then what came is, and something that people may have heard, they call it SOLAS, safety of life at sea, which requires a certain number of life jackets, certain number of lifeboats, and so on and so forth for ships. And so something very important that's still used today, that SOLAS came of this. But again, that the ethics, their design was faulty. They were boasting about this design, and it clearly wasn't thoroughly analyzed. And then the lifeboat decision certainly came into play there. So that's pretty much what I had for this morning. I'm happy to talk more about the cases or more about anything else in the presentation if people have questions. Go ahead, Sandy.
Great presentation, Mike. Thank you. And good, solid examples to kind of wrap our heads around this. I guess, there's something I struggle with, because we have the same thing with education. We have some standards and stuff. When things are worded, like you mentioned in one of your slides, where they say, like with fidelity, right? Like, is there clarifying language to allow people, like, when you tell people like make good choices, right? Be moral, like what are the bounds for that? Do they have clear in your classes and in these examples? Are there clear feedback on how to, what is unfairly with others, right? Compete unfairly with others, right?
Sure. I suspect, it's left a little intentionally vague. And the reason is because if they start listing examples, then is that list exhaustive, or is it constrain the issue? But I think in the overall, you could see certainly with like mechanical engineers, sorry to flip through, but with mechanical engineers, they have 3, 4 instances in their curriculum where they're talking about ethics. And the idea is, I think you give enough examples, you give enough discussion, and really try to build depth in their knowledge of the ethics challenge that could come up. I think you start building that where that is. But again, there's no real clear, and I think you see that in any field, quite frankly. They don't really get to in the weeds about what those things mean, because I think there's a general assumption that, it has to kind of pass the, I forget, what's the term, kind of the, does it make sense kind of test, like, the real simple test of, boy, that doesn't sound right, and if
Test, yeah.
and you get that, and I think that's what happens, and typically these these like ethics committees and review boards are a board of your peers, right? And so if someone says, boy, that doesn't sound right, I'm going to submit it to the review board, whether it's medical, law, or whatever. You could show that, and then it goes to this committee, and I think you start getting people that are enough people scratch their heads and say, boy, that doesn't sound right. What were you thinking? Then I think that's sort of the test on a lot of these. But again, it's one of those that, how do you, like you say, how do you tell them make good choices and stuff? What's the bar? I know with kids and stuff, it's like, act like I'm standing there behind, if you don't want me to find out about it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it, right? And there's pretty clear rules in some instances with that, but it's hard to say. It's hard to give too many specifics, because then if you start doing that, then somebody does something that's not on that list. Does that mean they're okay? Where do you put it?
Thank you.
Michael, I have a question. Thank you so much for all that you shared in your preparation. So when you were sharing that list of engineering standards, and it mentioned the safety, health, and welfare of people, of the public.
Yep.
So I'm going to go a little. So clearly there are many people that believe that climate change could be that issue.
Sure.
Very political. Is it a third rail that the industry isn't willing to touch? Are you feeling like students are seeing it as an ethical issue? Are you seeing any discussion?
So it is actually, if you look at number 8, the environmental impact starts showing up. I think that what you see is, I know any engineering, you look at the engineering of buildings, the engineering of ships, cars, whatever. I think that you're starting to see this environmental climate change is part of all those decisions, right? Now, are there trade-offs, right? Because sometimes you can't have a ship, let's do a car. You can't have a car that does certain things and is good for the environment, right? Sometimes there's design trade-offs that have to be made. And I think that's sort of where we're at right now is those trade-offs, what wins, right? Is it the environment that wins, or is it that people have cars that can go 0 to 60 in 4 seconds and, haul, 2 boats and whatever else, right? So there's these trade-offs that have to go in and stuff. And there's always going to be people that want the bigger engines with the more horsepower and things, which electric vehicles just don't produce. So there's trade-offs, and so you have to consider those things as you go through this. What types of materials you're building cars out of? What what happens when this car is what happens to electric cars, right? So everyone thinks electric cars are the answer, right? But you still have to produce the power, which is still going to use green, impact the climate. What do you do with the batteries at the end of the life of the car? Okay, and a lot of these cars are new enough that we haven't gotten to that battery issue yet, right? But what happens when we do, right? So again, there's trade-offs with all these things. I think, and again, you could find someone that would sit there and tell you all the negatives about, all these things that are considered more environmentally friendly and how they're not as environmentally friendly. The mining of the for the batteries, the mining of the materials and stuff is bad for the, all this stuff. But you could also go on the other side and see all the good. And again, so depending on who you're talking to, they're going to point out one argument or the other. And that's where it's been politicized, quite frankly, and it's a shame. And I think there is a push to probably advance technology maybe faster than it's ready to advance, or certainly that people are ready for it to advance. But at the same time, if you don't push those limits, you aren't going to have as much progress. So my feeling, quite frankly, I think if you how do you get people used to the idea of electric cars and seeing the advantage of them, right? I think that you have to win over the customer kind of first and hope the technology is ready when they are. Quite frankly, I think you make rental cars electric, right? People don't have a choice. You rent a car, it's electric, you drive it, and you might say, boy, that actually was kind of good. I didn't have to go to a gas station. It was pretty easy to charge it at the hotel or whatever, and you build that type of infrastructure and get people used to it and seeing the benefits themselves. And that may be helpful. But again, it's all politicized right now, especially right now, and which is a shame, because I think that I think we could push technology pretty fast if we did it the right way. So I think that answered your question. Yeah, I actually thought one of the ways when you start looking at safety, health, and welfare of public, the one big ethics thing that I try to avoid, but I'll bring it up now because we're close to the end and I'll have to get off at a certain point, is what about weapons, right? Engineers typically design and build weapons. There are schools that don't like the university to be partnering with military, right? Because of those type of things. So that becomes that's like a big ethical issue, right? It's sort of like the defense lawyer, right? It's one of those, they're doing a job and fulfilling a need, at the end of the day, if again, the arguments are all over the place for and against, developing weapons, right? If no one ever developed a weapon, we'd be fine. But that one person that does develop the weapons, they're in pretty good shape themselves, right? So that's sort of it's sort of a keeping up with the Joneses and being able to defend, and I think the argument for them is typically a defense argument, right? It's so we could defend ourselves and have that presence. So, but that's one that engineers certainly struggle with and go from there. There's clearly a big industry built on those type of things, and there's certainly engineers that graduate from schools that go and do those jobs, and that's something they have to struggle with on a personal level and figure out if that's really how they want to be using their knowledge and expertise.
Thanks, Michael.
Michael, I have a question.
Yes.
Tracy? My question is, your great presentation, by the way. All of us in higher education have accreditation issues for whatever discipline, and we have to prove or show that they're meeting these learning outcomes. How do you address in the College of Engineering evaluation? It's the biggest question that the Daniels Fund is always looking at, is how do we know that the students are understanding and learning these ethical concepts?
So so we wouldn't necessarily take, this is student outcome number 4 on the screen here. We wouldn't take that and decide if the students have met that. What we do is we create from that number 4, we create like 2 or 3 what we call Coast Guard Academy. The different departments here have different terms. We call them performance indicators, right? So a student should be able to show this thing. And I could send you an example of what some of those are, but we have those performance indicators for each. And there's like, I think 7 student outcomes now in the top one here. I'm not sure, I'm not as familiar with the bottom one because that wasn't my world, but there's 7 of these things now. So each of the 7 have like 2 or 3 performance indicators. And then we assess those performance indicators using a variety of things. We call them barometric assignments. So we had different assignments that might show that the student grasped the material. We have rubrics that the students would fill out or the faculty would fill out as they observe the students in some cases. And some of these criteria, so this is the one about ethics. One of them is communicate effectively or whatever. So that's something that could be measured by observation. You know, they're given a presentation, you're rating them on these things. And so there's a whole list of these things that come in. But we would look at the performance indicators, and then we would show that whether or not the students were meeting those things. The performance. I'm trying to look at my thing here so I can show you this. This is unexpected direction, but I'm gonna try to do it here. Screen. All right, so this is a paper myself and some colleagues wrote. I assume you can see the paper still. Okay, so in here, for each performance indicator success in one or more courses. So again, what we try to do is we call it triangulation. So that performance indicator, we would have a couple different assignments, a rubric or something else, to try to look at it from different directions, right? And I can show you, this is, so ABET recently changed their system, and I apologize for the scrolling, but we used to call them these ED whatever, and they've changed these ED01s and stuff to the 1 through 7. They just changed them. So you can see some of them are pretty straightforward. Ability to function on a multidisciplinary team, right? So we would use like student evaluations of each other. We would use our own observations of the students on that, and we do it in a couple different courses to see if they accomplish, you know, see if they met the standard for that. And then we had, you know, ratings for those things, and you can see there's a bunch of different ones. The ethics used to be a little different in where is it? It was written a little different back then, but again, they changed. Oh, here it is. Understand professional and ethical responsibility. ED06. So those have changed to these newer ones. And again, we're looking at those things, but again, we're not looking at doing these outcomes. We're looking at the performance indicators, which would lead towards the outcomes, if that makes sense. So we broke these into smaller statements. Let me see if they're in here. And I could send this to, and it's a schedule. So I don't think we have them listed here, but we would take those performance indicators. I don't know how to stop sharing. Those performance indicators and evaluate those with using a couple different, in some cases it was a homework assignment or a lab or a paper they had to write or something like that, or, you know, and then the rubrics and all that stuff. And again, you get it from a couple different directions. You get some, and then we kind of combine the scores and have a score. We also measured whether we were trending up, trending down, and then by how much we met. In some cases, they met it pretty, you know, quite easily, and everybody in the class met it. Other cases, you know, 75% of the students would meet and others not. And then we try to figure out how do we improve that number and build it. So ABET's different than AACSB because ABET is a program accreditation. I believe AACSB is an institutional accreditation. So I don't know if they get in, you know, as far into the weeds as some of these. I looked this morning, it's clear that ethics is part of what they're looking for, just in my quick review of it. But there's certainly different pieces here. And I could send you this paper if you're interested, and you can look at what we have here. But, you know, different departments do it a little bit different. At the end of each course, we would, and I know we're kind of off topic, but at the end of each course, we would evaluate how the course went, and, you know, and with specific focus on the areas of the course that go towards accreditation. Some courses, almost the entire course, like certainly like senior design would be almost every one of those criteria gets touched on it. More like intro level courses probably wouldn't have anything. And again, we look at building the skill set over time, you know, so that was something, and that's the way ABET used to work, is you had to show this course is kind of foundational, this course is building the thing, and this course they should master that outcome. And we would rank the courses on that, but they changed the way it's every 6 years they change something in it, so we have to revamp what we're doing, but which is pretty fun. So we have ABET coming up so next year's our data collection, next academic year is our data collection year. And then we submit our self-studies summer of 23. So we're gearing up for it right now. So
yeah, AACSB is exactly the same way. I mean, it's institution, but it's also the program and the assurance of learning. And our challenge, and the challenge with the Daniels Fund is how to evaluate ethics and ethical decision making and things like that. It gets complicated. I see Colin has a question, so I'll let him answer his.
Sure.
Ask his.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. I was an aerospace engineering major at university before I switched to music, so have some recollection of that. And one of the things that you said really resonated with me because I talked about it a little bit in my presentation last time, this idea about if you go outside your area of expertise, sometimes that's, even though you don't think of it as being a breach of ethics, it can be. And of course, in music, that doesn't result in loss of life as it might in engineering. But I think of many of our college students who, of course, we all at that age thought we knew a lot more than we really did. Do you find that principle is one of the most challenging to teach students in engineering?
Well, it's interesting because in my experience with senior design is that the students they actually want to focus on one area and not be that broad because they really like that one area and don't like the other areas, and try to, within their team, really specialize in something. So we had to kind of push to say, hey, you're all responsible for all of this. So even though you're not working on that, you need to understand it. I think as they get out, so and maybe it's worth mentioning, so the licensing process for an engineer is probably a little different than others, right? You finish law school, you take the bar exam, you're licensed, right? And same with medical. You finish your schooling, you take your medical boards and your licensed nurses, same thing. So with engineers, so typically an engineer when they're probably late in their junior year or their senior year, they would take what's called the fundamentals of engineering exam. Okay, so now when they pass that, now they're considered I think the term they use is engineer in training, right? So there's really, before you can take the professional engineering exam, you have to have a certain amount of experience, or if you go to grad school, that counts as a little and stuff. So you're almost an apprentice for a few years. So you can't go out and certify things as safety tested and things like that because you don't have that license and you're working for someone who does. And then once you get all that experience, then you take that professional engineering, and now you're actually a professional engineer licensed in the state of whatever. And similar to nurses and doctors, some states have agreements with each other and so on and so forth. As part of being licensed, you have to have continuing education. Some states have more requirements than others, but those all come into play. So really, I think that it's not just here at the academic level that we talk about that area of expertise, but I think when they get to the field, they should be seeing a lot of that as well, right? So if you're working for somebody whose job is to, strength test steel, right? Something comes up, they're probably going to say, oh, well, you should probably go to so-and-so, that's their world, right? You bring in that other person to, that third party person to look at the other thing because it's not your field of expertise, right? And a lot of these folks, these professional engineers, yes, some are doing design and things like that. Like I wound up take out one of the columns in my basement, right? So I had a professional engineer come out, a structural engineer come out, figure out what type of beam we needed to put in the thing. And that I could probably have done the calculations, with some help from some of the other faculty at school, but that's not our job, right? So I went to the person, he actually tells me what I need. You can't even buy the beam without that letter. And he stamped it with his professional engineering stamp. So now he's on the hook if anything goes wrong, right? So that's the part of outside your expertise that you don't want to be, right? Because at some point you're on the hook, and if they find out, why did you think you could sign off on this, and it comes back to you, it's going to be pretty significant. Plus, the liability. So I think I think most people kind of get that. I don't think it's as, one of those things that we have a lot of time to focus on. But we do try to hit on those things while they're here. But I think that's more of a on the job side of it.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes that like the sciences, it's so much easier in a way because you do have all this licensing and everything. In the humanities fields, it's who's an expert, right? It's
Yeah.
because you say you're an expert sometimes. So
No,
great,
and
thank you.
Even if you want to put an addition on your house, right? So you'd have to get that structural engineer to come in and tell you, and do the design and stamp it, and then it goes to what the city or town or whatever to be approved by their engineers. So there's multiple layers in a lot of these things to try to, for the sake of safety, and I think the town engineers generally make sure that you're meeting the requirements, and that you actually went and talked to someone. I can't draw up a new garage addition onto my house as much as I'd like to and start building it without all those approvals. So I think that's pretty important in there as well. But yeah, who's the expert? But when you're looking for someone, a good, even tradesman will show their license number and that they're insured and stuff like that. And that generally is the first step towards kind of thinking they're a little more credible than others.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, Michael, and you presented a lot of great ideas that we'll be able to use. And with that, I'm going to thank you and thank our audience for great questions, and enjoy the rest of the day. And everyone have a great holiday. Our next roundtable starts in the last week of January, and hopefully we'll be in person. So again, thank you so much.